Hello everyone. I think we're still coming in to join the webinar, but I just wanted to welcome you. I'm John Tain, Head of Research at Asia Art Archive, and it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to today's panel, Reflections on Modern Art Histories in and Across Africa, South and Southeast Asia. Rest assured, in the hour to follow, you are not going to be treated to a summary of modernist art histories of the three regions, but rather a conversation on the program that went by the same name, which is affectionately known by its acronym MAHASSA. MAHASSA is a collaboration between Cornell University's Institute for Comparative Modernities, the Dhaka Art Summit, and Asia Art Archive. Occurring in two parts, the project convened 21 younger scholars and faculty members and organizers. So there were about 30 of us, including tonight's company, but also Simon Soon, Sanjukta Sundarasan, and Ming Tianpo. And we were all in Hong Kong last August for nearly 2 weeks of intense intellectual and cultural exchange between us, and also with colleagues at Asia Art Archive and invited guest speakers from other institutions such as Parasite and M+. Then, this past February, participants reconvened during the Dhaka Art Summit, joined this time by additional faculty member, including Salah Hassan, Zahia Rahmani, and Farhan Karim, but also all of the guests, including artists and others who were in attendance at the summit. In retrospect, given everything that has happened in the world, the gatherings were amazing for what they taught about events of the last century in light of international developments and globalization, and but also just surely in terms of logistics and travel that we were able to all come together. And I think as maybe you'll hear from Diana, it's kind of amazing that we were able to have such a gathering of people from all corners of the world. Even just as recently as last February, or this past February. So I will introduce each of the speakers in order, and we will have presentations of about 10 to 15 minutes, and then questions and answers at the end. So I will begin by introducing Diana. Diana Campbell is a Princeton-educated curator who over the last decade has been working in building art institutions in South and Southeast Asia. Since 2013, she has served as the founding artistic director of the Dhaka-based Samdani Art Foundation in Bangladesh and chief curator of the Dhaka Art Summit, leading the critically acclaimed biennial editions from 2014 to 2020, which has also served as an important research and exhibition platform for art from South Asia, one that brings together artists, architects, curators, and writers through a largely commission-based model. In addition to her exhibition-making practice, Campbell has developed the Samdani Art Foundation collection and drives its international collaborations ahead of the opening of the foundation's permanent home, Shuhata, the Samdani Art Center and Sculpture Park in Sylhet, Bangladesh. If all of this was not enough accomplishment, she has also served as the founding artistic director of Bellas Artes projects in the Philippines from 2016 to 2018, and as the curator of Frieze projects for the 2018 and 2019 fair editions in London, and chairs the board of the Mumbai Art Room in India. Our second speaker, Iftikhar Dadi, is an associate professor at Cornell University's Department of History of Art and director of the South Asia program. He teaches and researches modern and contemporary art from a global and transnational perspective. His writings have focused on modernism and contemporary practice of Asia, the Middle East, and their diasporas. Another research interest examines the film, media, and popular cultures of South Asia, seeking to understand how emergent publics forge new avenues for civic participation. And this is actually his upcoming project, I believe. His previous works include Modernism and the Art of Muslim South Asia, published in 2010, the edited monograph Anwar Jalal Shamsa from 2015, the co-edited catalog Lines of Control from 2012, and the reader Unpacking Europe from 2001. He has also authored essays that have appeared in numerous journals, edited volumes, and online platforms. Dadi serves currently on the editorial and advisory boards of the journals Archives of Asian Art and Bioscope, South Asian Screen Studies, and he has been a member of the editorial board of Art Journal. He is an advisor to Asia Art Archive and a great friend of the organization. Finally, last but not least, we have Elizabeth Giorgis, who is Associate Professor of Art History, Criticism, and Theory in the College of Performing and Visual Art and the Center for African and Asian Studies at Addis Ababa University, and in the past has served as a Dean of the College of Performing and Visual Art and as Director of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at the same institution. Also at the university, she is the director of the Modern Art Museum, Gebre Christos Desta Center, where she has curated numerous exhibitions. She is the editor and author of several publications, including Modernist Art in Ethiopia, the first comprehensive monographic study of Ethiopian visual modernism within a broader social and intellectual history, and the book was shortlisted for the African Studies Association UK Fage and Olivier Prize for Original and Outstanding Scholarship on Africa. In addition to participating in international conferences and public lectures at Cornell University, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Academy of Fine Art in Vienna, among others, she convened the first African humanities initiative called Africa as Concept, Decolonization, Emancipation, and Freedom, organized by the Consortium of the Humanities, Centers, and Institutes. So without further ado, I will pass the screen to Diana, who will be giving an introduction to MAHASSA.
Great, thank you so much, John, and thank you so much to everyone who's joining us now. Working on this project has really been one of the most rewarding experiences in my professional career. And I guess my next 10 minutes are here to kind of explain how this came about and how such a scholarly platform took center stage in what was supposed to be a contemporary art exhibition. So I'll start sharing my screen now. So the Dhaka Art Summit is an exhibition and research platform that was started in 2012 by the young collector couple Nadia and Rajib Samdani. So around 2011, 2012 was when a lot of museums around the world were trying to build these South Asian acquisitions councils to try to bring works from non-Western contexts into museums like Tate, or Pompidou was also interested at the time. There was a lot of global interest. But what the Samdani saw at that time was that there was actually a lack of knowledge and research into Bangladesh. So when people said South Asia, they really meant India and maybe a little bit of Pakistan, but no one had any clue what was happening in Bangladesh, which has an extremely rich art scene. So in a lot of marketing materials of certain biennials, like the Gwangju Biennial, it claimed to be the oldest biennial in Asia, but actually the oldest continually running biennial in Asia is the Asian Art Biennale in Bangladesh that was started in 1981. Bangladesh has a really rich history of international exhibitions. And so while this started in 2012 as a contemporary art platform, so rather than funding Bangladeshi artists to be in shows all around the world, they wanted to create something in Bangladesh that would bring the world to come learn about art within its context. The 2012 edition, which didn't have a curator, it was planned in 3 months, started to open up people's eyes as to what was happening in Bangladesh. So for example, Tayyaba Begum Lippi's work, Love Caught, which is now in the Guggenheim's collection, had its debut in the 2012 Dhaka Art Summit. I came on board soon after to plan the 2014 summit, which again was mostly contemporary, but what I realized was that there was a really rich modern art history that scholars didn't have access to. It wasn't written about in art history books because no one had seen it. A lot of it was in government storage, in ambassadors' houses, or just not accessible to the public. So this image that you're seeing here for the 2016 edition was an exhibition called Rewind, which was curated by me, Amara Antilla, Beth Citron, and Sabi Ahmed, where we looked at the development of abstraction out of figurative practices in India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan. And it was bringing together practices that hadn't been seen together in quite some time, and some loans that hadn't been seen. So for example, in the back of this image, you see a triptych by Zuhur Al-Akhlaq that was in the Pakistani embassy in Dhaka that again hadn't been seen in years. And this was a moment, because we also invited scholars to come to the summit, that it was kind of a light bulb in my head that we had this ability to rather than just focusing on producing new works, a way to kind of fill gaps in scholarship, and to, yeah, I guess invite art historians into the center of our exhibition practice to help us learn alongside them about the context with which today's art scene in Bangladesh came from. This is a beautiful image of works by Monica Correa paired with tapestries by Raschi Chaudhary. So this was one of Raschi Chaudhary's first major international exhibitions. And since this time, through the generosity of the Samdani Art Foundation, there are works by Rashid in the Met's collection, also in Tate's collection. And there's a newfound interest in this incredible but underknown artist working with fiber from the 60s until the 80s. And again, pairing his works with Monica, they were working at the same time, but neither of them really had much scholarship or exhibition opportunities. These are some incredible, again, works by Raschi Chaudhary, who these tapestries are mixing together Hindu, Christian, animist, and Muslim traditions, and looking at that, I guess that fabric that held together village life in rural Bengal. And again, most of these works came from private collections that scholars wouldn't necessarily have access to. So I think one of the things that we really do at Samdani Art Foundation, and it's different from a biennial because there's continuity across editions, we build and add to the things that we learn from each edition, which is how MAHASSA came about. But as we have relationships with collectors, they'll introduce us to other collectors, or as institutions start to trust us, we're able to really build upon the yeah, I guess the capacity of the institution to give the public access to transformative works of art. And John alluded to this, but our last Dhaka Art Summit, which ended February 15th, had 477,153 visitors in 9 days. On February 14th alone, we had 111,000 visitors. So this is a massively viewed exhibition by all walks of life, be it curators, lay people, families, museum directors, artists, writers. I guess, as I said, each edition is building toward the next thing. So I would say that this major embodied event is building towards something in a COVID world where we have to decentralize and work digitally. But trying to connect people that wouldn't otherwise meet is something at the core of what we do. This is a beautiful example, again, of the kind of research and agency we build at the foundation. This was from Dhaka Art Summit 2018, and through our research, we found the first work of, I guess, Bangladeshi art that showed internationally. So Bangladeshi independence happened in 1971. This 13-panel mural created by an artist collective that's no longer active at Chittagong University called Oti Shamputik Amra was a 13-panel mural that basically narrated the history of Bengal from ancient times through colonization into independence. And when they went to show this work in Calcutta, there were no passports. So the founder of the country had to issue them road permits to get into Calcutta to show this. But again, no one knew that this work still existed. It was quite a bit of work to reunite these panels and to get the loan approved. But again, we were able to make this work massively publicly accessible. So in 2017, I knew that I wanted to have some kind of majorly scholar or embodied scholarly happening in Dhaka. So we tested it out in a kind of lighter form, which was called our Scholars Weekend. So we convened 2 symposia, one that was led by Mustafa at the National Gallery of Singapore, which was about Ananda Kumar Swamy and looking at these cross sections between South and Southeast Asia, and another one on international exhibition histories in Asia that was led by Amara and Tilla. And Amara and I had been having discussions with Joan Weinstein at the Getty Foundation, who came and attended the Dhaka Art Summit in 2018 and saw the scholarship that we were producing and saw the agency that we were giving scholars and invited us to apply for the grant for the MAHASSA program, which I'll get back into in a minute. This is another example of trying to look at cross sections of art history outside of this kind of East-West, or I guess almost, because of the colonial history with Britain, there's so much happening between the UK and South Asia, but Bangladesh and Southeast Asia also have a very strong history, because I mentioned this Asian Art Biennale in 1981. Again, Bangladesh wanted to chart its identity via other Asian countries. So again, the country is 10 years old, and I was living in the Philippines for 2 years, and I did a research fellowship at the Fukuoka Asian Art Museum. And I found these images of Syed Jahangir, who was an artist and one of the founders of the Asian Art Biennale, when he was around my age, sitting in Fukuoka, doing research as a consultant for the museum, when he decided to start this platform. And what was so interesting, just sharing notes with colleagues, one of them, Patrick Flores in the Philippines, where he asked me to take pictures of the catalog essay from the 1983 Asian Art Biennale, I found a line that the works had been donated to the government of Bangladesh. So works by Filipino artists were somehow in the Bangladeshi National Collection. So my amazing assistant curator and I went on this like deep dive, and we found some of these works that were in storage in the same building, the Bangladesh Shilpakala Academy, where the Dhaka Art Summit happens. And it was kind of this light bulb that there were all of these histories and connections that, Patrick hadn't been to Bangladesh. The Bangladeshi people working on this didn't know that these works were, or that these artists were important, or that these works were actually in their collection. And some of these artists were still alive. So on the video screen, you see an interview with Phyllis Zaballero, where she talks about her experience making this work for Bangladesh. And it was also, I guess, that moment where we knew that actually we needed to actively do something to bring together scholars. So first it was between Southeast Asia and South Asia, but further afield to Africa because of the colonial histories, to look at these shared histories. So Bangladesh, for example, a lot of people might have heard about the Bengal famines, and Elizabeth will talk about this later, but Ethiopia has connections to that as well. And also the founding of institutions. It's different. We don't, the way that institutions and art schools were founded in Africa, South and Southeast Asia have a lot in common, but most of the time to talk about this, we have to meet in America, Canada, or in Europe. Why can't we have it within, I guess, a different context like Bangladesh? So we're so thankful to the Getty Foundation, and also I'm so thankful to my team, like including Iftikhar, for really coming up with a vision to create a program that could open up to so many people. This is another image from Dhaka Art Summit 2018, which was an exhibition curated by Vali Maluji about the Festival of Art Shiraz Persepolis from 1966 to 1977. So Iran was also part of the Asian Art Biennale. Iran, for a certain time, saw itself as part of Asia. It has links with Asia. Look at the language, look at the art. So we've always been trying to rechart how we look at Asia, how we look at Bangladesh relative to Asia, how Bangladesh sees itself relative to other parts of the world. I guess these scholarly platforms and opportunities to commission new research are very much a part of what we do. This is an image from that Scholars Weekend in Dhaka Art Summit 2018. You can see John Tain there, you can see Iftikhar. So we have a lot of repeat figures across these summits, which we love. So it's not about like burning everything down and building it up again. It's actually about what's the accretive process of everything that we learn. And that's something I think is really special about the Dhaka Art Summit, is that every time you go, you understand the place better. So it's a place of repetition and transformation. This is an image of another project that was really close to my heart, which was the critical writing ensembles, where we brought together Indigenous peers, writers and curators from Oceania, from Southeast Asia, from Europe, from South Asia. But again, it's this meeting of people that wouldn't otherwise meet. And I'll let Iftikhar and Elizabeth talk a bit more about the corpus of scholars that we brought together in Dhaka. But again, it was such an honor and a pleasure to be able to host these minds and hopefully open them, or to see what comes of this in the future as new textbooks start to be written that don't take Europe or North America as the center of all artistic discourse. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you see me? Okay. So I'll speak about the program that we did in Hong Kong as well as in Dhaka, and how the kind of the concepts behind the program and how it all came together. So let me share my screen. So we ended up when this project got going with the assistance of the Getty Foundation, and we had to write a grant to the Getty Foundation to to support this project. It's a partnership between three institutions. So it's a Dhaka Art Summit, which Diana already talked about, Asia Art Archive, and the Institute for Comparative Modernities at Cornell University, where I'm based. And the idea was to think about, to bring together a team of faculty and emerging, scholars, and to investigate parallel and intersecting developments in basically modern art and architecture in this region, which would be the South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa, or a big chunk of what we might call the global South. The reason for thinking about this region in kind of comparative and shared ways is because they also share a modern history, right, which has to do with similar experiences, which includes their decolonization in the 20th century, especially in the second half of the 20th century, their prior colonial kind of experience, the way institutions such as museums and art schools were founded, the problems of artistic form and its relation to kind of a society which is undergoing very rapid and change, the relation that artists had with other forms, which is very important. So to look at literature, poetry, fiction, cinema, performance practices, architecture, as well as folk practices and traditional practices. Also the question of how what we may call national art histories develop really through exchange, both with international metropolitan centers and also with movement of ideas through publications and exhibitions, and not just through via metropolitan centers like London and Paris and New York, but as Diana mentioned, also the south to south exchanges, which are frequently neglected. And certainly the question of what art can do, its form, its aesthetics, and its relation to kind of questions of social change, politics, society, economics, definitely in a kind of a comparative global south perspective. So we planned 2 10-day intensive meetings, and these were extremely intensive. I think we can all agree on that. They were a combination of seminars, lectures, workshops, and field trips, and that focused on basically questions of method. So post-colonial, decolonial, transnational, and global frameworks for thinking about the developments of the cultural developments of the 20th century, especially focusing on art. The problem of modernism, whether there is a singular modernism, whether there are multiple modernism, what really is the relation between kind of what might be called the universality of modernism and its kind of local manifestations, the relation between art and society, the rise of formal pedagogy, both formal and informal pedagogy. So art schools, but also places like cafes and salons where discussions were held, as well as alternative spaces. Many of them artists run galleries and exhibition spaces where people would come together and debate things and also show works together. The question of exhibition histories, a little bit, Diana already mentioned. Okay, this is an important research question that work is coming out now, but much more needs to be done. But as well as transnational networks of the exchange of people, ideas, objects, and knowledge. And practices, again, via metropolitan centers, but as well as via global south kind of exchanges. The questions of nationalisms certainly throughout the 20th century, but definitely problems that get pronounced in the wake of political decolonization, which would be the second half of the 20th century. And the problems of culture in relation to the question of tradition, to nationalism, but also to transnationalism. And finally, an important theme is how basically high art or artistic practice can be situated with respect to other more popular forms. So that would include traditional practices, folk practices, but also popular culture like magazines, radio, television, cinema, and media. Then among the concepts we brought to this is that viewing this in statist and nationalist art histories often obscures their analysis in comparative frameworks. So one of the things that we've been lacking is that we've had some national histories of these various developments, but we haven't seen these in relation in kind of comparative frameworks. So our focus in MAHASSA was specifically to foreground the comparative and transnational aspects of these developments, while not neglecting the specificity of their local and national framings. And so we emphasize a connected approach to better understand both common developments as well as divergent trajectories. And we had a very, I must say, ambitious curriculum, okay, which covered both kind of core concepts as well as emerging perspectives, as well as case studies. And finally, I can't emphasize enough the importance of holding these sessions for 10 intensive days each in Hong Kong and Dhaka, which are both very different but very, very rich and embodied sites for, in a sense, thinking about these issues. As I mentioned, also combined with field trips and visits to local institutions and intellectuals and artists and so on. Now we had, in our faculty, we had the people who read the seminars was myself, Elizabeth Giorgis, whom you're going to speak hear from next, Ming Tiempo, who's a professor of art history at Carleton University, Canada. She has done some work on Gutai in Japan, and is now working on transnational, mid to later 20th century transnational practices. Salah Hassan, who's professor and director, professor of art history and Africana studies and director of the Institute for Comparative Modernities at Cornell, and a specialist in African and African American Africana diaspora art, and also publishes, one of the editors of the journal NKA, which is a journal devoted to African and African diaspora art. Sanjukta Sundarsong is at the University of Leiden, looking at India and questions of art in relation to society, but also looking at kind of transnational practices that are part of the decolonization and non-aligned movements. Simon Soon is based at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, and working on Southeast Asia, but also working on how modernism today is better understood by situating it with practices that are not really part of thinking in art, which includes performance practices, religious ceremonies, etc. And the organizers included Amara Antilla, who was at the Guggenheim and is now senior curator at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati. Chung Dai-Wo at Hong Kong-based in Asia Art Archive. Diana, you already heard from. John, you heard from. And Michelle Wong, also a researcher based in Hong Kong. Nupur Desai and Sneha Raghavan, based in Asia Art Archive researchers based in Delhi. So you can see that this was not was a kind of an ambitious and multifarious kind of a program, which was certainly not the work of a single individual. And the participants included, we had 21 advanced graduate students and junior faculty who are researching art in Africa, art and architecture in Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and they're based in Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, and North America. It's a picture. Here's a picture of from Hong Kong, from one of our field trips. So let me stop here.
Okay. Can I start now? I think I'm good. I have my video and the mute on. Anyway, I'm Elizabeth. Okay, so the images can come later, but I'm Elizabeth. So first, I would like to thank Dr. Jane, I can never pronounce her last name, and the Beauvois and the Asian Art Archive America for inviting me to be part of the panel. And second, I'm really grateful for having been part of the MAHASSA project, and would like to thank my former Cornell professor, Iftikhar Dadi, for bringing me on board to this wonderful experience, being part of the faculty and the experiences through Asian Art Archive Hong Kong and the Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh was truly phenomenal. I had rarely engaged in the art scholarship of South and Southeast Asia, and for me it was a great learning experience. And what I also saw in Dhaka with the Dhaka Art Summit was really phenomenal. Diana was saying earlier about 470,000 people came to see the Dhaka Art Summit exhibition. So it was amazing. So I've been to many biennales and art fairs, and I've never seen such attendance from the public. So thank you, Diana, for organizing a wonderful exhibition and for having us witness that. Having said that, so I'm reflecting on what happened in MAHASSA. Particularly, I'm really looking at it from the African side. So MAHASSA for me, and I think for most of the intelligent and wonderful participants who graced this project, brought lots of questions rather than answers on the connected histories of art from South and Southeast Asia and Africa. And I've observed that the connection discussion mostly centered, particularly in our gathering in Hong Kong, around South and Southeast Asia rather than Africa, although we tried to rectify this in our gathering at Dhaka. I should have corrected the situation in Hong Kong, being the faculty member from Africa, but I thought when we initially met in Hong Kong that by simply interjecting the multiple African modernist experiences, we would somehow find parallels with the Asian experience. While I think a lot of us learned quite a bit about the African experience through the different texts I proposed, I think we still conducted the discussion around the issues of modernism from regional Asian perspectives. And I think now in retrospect that I should have focused more around the overarching themes that are essential to understand modernism in both contexts, such as colonial education. I think Iftikhar mentioned it briefly earlier, colonial education and its impact in the understanding of tradition and modernism in all contexts, the understanding of modernity itself as a colonial project, and what modernism means through this lens, etc., in all contexts. So I think Iftikhar initiated these issues when we first started our session in Hong Kong, what modernity and modernism meant in different contexts, and as theorized from different perspectives that was outside the classical canon, etc. So like the power relations that pertain to the project of modernity, but we did not go too far, I think. So on the other hand, it's also fair to say that there were some attempts in Hong Kong to see the connection between Africa and South and Southeast Asia through what were easily familiar historical moments to both of our contexts, such as Bandung and the Afro-Asian movement. And these attempts, I believe, opened up doors for more research to be done rather than definitive answers on where the connections were. So I don't think we found precise answers even in our second attempt in Dhaka, which I'll talk about later. But on my part, I've definitely found hints on where and how we can do more research. So as I have indicated, Iftikhar said nationalism, that's one concept. Colonialism played a big part in the articulation of modernism for both contexts. but how did this manifest in Asia and Africa through a common ground? Were there commonalities? These are questions that I should have extensively asked and that I have not thoroughly asked, and I think should be an important starting point for a future MAHASSA project, which I hope there will be. So, though we all refer to these queries in some capacity, I think we should do more to find the connection through such overarching themes, ideas that are most certainly relevant and are behind the multiple articulations of the modernisms of Africa, Asia, and Southeast Asia. I believe it's very important to tackle with the extremely contested notions and imaginations of modernity and modernism if we're going to have a South-South conversation. And these imaginations do not come from a prescriptive rule of modernism that is laid out, but through knowledge of the contested political and intellectual histories of modernism in the non-West. For instance, Iftikhar's book on South Asian modernism has a global resonance in its approach. Although it is a book about South Asian Muslim modernism, it has nevertheless greatly influenced my own work and its approach to understand modernism in my context, and was a great asset to the writing of my book. Why? Because the book talked about different and contested ideas behind the global idea of modernity, colonial or otherwise, and then the genesis and evolution of South Asian Muslim modernism within this modernist trajectory. So I think participants raised this issue several times, which I felt we did not address much. So indeed, it could have been challenging to make the connection, even if we included these overarching themes, because the concept and experiences of modernism itself also takes different forms and interpretation and is unevenly experienced in all these contexts. For example, if we take the Nigerian context, and one can read Chika Okeke Agulu's book, what we call modernism came much earlier than many other African countries. So it's probably easier to make the parallel between Nigerian modernism and, let us say, South Asian modernism, because these modernisms emerged around the same time. So perhaps the practices of British colonialism brought about an experience of modernism that can be shared. I don't know, I'm just saying that because Nigeria was colonized by the British. But if I take Ethiopia, which was never colonized, one can say modernism mainly manifested in the 1960s after the opening of the art school in 1957 as a semblance of modernity. And this modernism was work in progress until the famine of 1973. And then there was closure for 17 years because of the reign of the military junta, which imposed dictated aesthetic until 1991. And really, it's after 1991 that we experienced multiple articulations of modernism, which means we cannot talk about modernism unless we also talk about the contemporary, since the 1960s filtered to the 1990s. So we cannot also talk about modernism, for instance, in Ethiopia, as well as many other African countries, without talking about modernity and the projects of modernity, which is a modern education that produced the art schools, which produced the modernism of the period, which abhorred tradition, maybe in the African context. So there is therefore multiple understandings and translations of modernism in the African context, as it is in Asia and Southeast Asia. Perhaps, as I've indicated earlier, we should have focused more on the ideas behind what tied these multiplicities together. That is, in addition to the overarching theme of colonialism and its projects, let's say, like I said, the formation of art schools within this project of modernity, the types of knowledge production in these art schools and the public, art schools and politics, art schools and intellectual history. And this through an analysis that can connect histories. I think we concentrated more on artist subjectivity rather than the larger, and may I say, global ideas that formed and shaped the artists in question. So when we initially started the conversation in Hong Kong, we all brought our own perspectives. And as I've said, there was not much that manifested our commonalities between the African and Asian. I'm looking at it from the African perspective, other than Bandung and the Afro-Asian writing movement. More than Bandung, it was probably the Afro-Asian writing movement that Dr. Sanjukta Sundarsen presented that showed some semblance of connection. And that itself was limited to certain Egyptian writers and filmmakers like Ousmane Sembène from Senegal, etc. So I recently read an article on the International Consortium of Critical Theory, actually an interview by Hala Halim with Nehad Salem, an Egyptian translator around the time of the African writing movement, who also translated for Lotus. So I found out on that interview a wealth of information such as African leaders who participated in the Afro-Asian solidarity movement, the gendered perspective of that movement, etc. Perhaps my focus should have gone there, but this is just to say more should be done. And a platform like MAHASSA not only opens the door for these types of research, but it is also an important platform to reestablish or continue the axis of solidarity that was once there. So I think we tried to correct that, the deficiencies of connectedness, particularly from the African side in Dhaka. And the Dhaka experience was different than Hong Kong, since there were quite a few African artists in the exhibition itself. I think that probably helped. Salah Hassan also came as a keynote and talked about African modernism, which was also great. With Dr. Sanjukta Sundarsen's suggestion, we also tried to bring the philosophy of negritude together with Lotus and the Afro-Asian writing movement, which I thought was also good. However, I talked to some participants later on who thought Glisa was a better choice than Senghor, and they did not really see the correlation. Perhaps, but there was an attempt to bridge the gap. The second thing we did in Dhaka, again with Sanjukta, was the Art and Hunger panel, which I thought was fantastic, that attempted to bring the two histories together. So we can slide. Can you go next? Hillary, are you there? Next. So, but now thinking in retrospect, I think we could have done more around, next. Okay, so we'll wait for her. This one, yeah, around that too. So of course, the panel was about the Great Bengali Famine of 1943 and the Ethiopian Famine of 1973 and 1984. And how artists responded to these episodes of famine. Looking back at the video now, I wonder if we really had made a connection about a parallel experience, that of Aberdeen, and the artists I brought about. So this is the slide, the artists of the exhibition. The artists that I brought for the talk. So we both talked about our own work and really did not bring the two experiences together, but still, it was a very good panel. I think Sanjukta came up with the idea, which I think was brilliant. Perhaps also in our future research, we should look at episodes such as the famine, not only the famine itself, but the ideas or politics behind the famine that can bring us together. I'd like to bring one anecdote in this statement I've just made. It was after the Dhaka panel that I found out Amartya Sen, who you all know, had correlated these two famines in interesting ways. No famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy, he wrote in Democracy as Freedom in 1999. This, he explained, is because democratic governments have to win elections and face public criticism and have strong incentive to understand measures to avert famines and other catastrophes. So when the ILO and the International Labour Organization asked him to look into the causes of famines in the mid-1970s, Mr. Sen decided to focus on the Great Bengali Famine of 1943, in which as many as 3 million people had died. And as a 9-year-old boy, he said he was in a privileged Bengal family. He said he had seen the suffering firsthand. So it was widely assumed that famines were caused by sudden food shortage. And examining records, however, Mr. Sen found that food production in Bengal had not declined. Rather, I think Sanjukta talked about this too. Rather, food prices had soared while farm wages had sagged, making it hard for rural workers to buy food. So the absence of a free press and opposition parties, he thought, meant there was no one to sound the alarm. Mr. Sen is arguing that famines do not occur in democracies. So I'd like to explain why I'm suddenly referring to Amartya Sen and his famine. It is because of the following incident. Ethiopia had been going through a massive political transformation for the last 3 years, and for the first time, a democratic election was to be held this coming August. But the state said it feared that the COVID-19 situation is not going to allow that. And so it decided to postpone the election indefinitely. The state has already implemented a state of emergency because of the pandemic. And this state of emergency gives the state complete authority to ban any form of individual right in pretext of the pandemic and until it decides to set the date of election. So who knows how the COVID-19 situation will turn out? Even if there is a vaccine produced, it will be in the West, and it may take 2 or 3 more years to arrive to Africa. Some scholars and politicians thought that this was one way to prolong a state that has never been elected, fairly elected. And one prominent scholar thought about Amartya Sen's view in a televised debate, which he translated as, it's precisely because we don't have democratic rights because of this pandemic that we should conduct the election as planned to protect our democratic rights. Now, it's this idea of democratic rights that we should have talked about when we talked about the famine in Bengal or Ethiopia. I think we both talked about it to a certain extent, but it's primarily this commonality that ties the Bengali famine to the Ethiopian famine, the politics behind the two famines, the transnational nature of global capital, and consequently the lack of the exercise of democratic rights that brought out the famines, and along with it, the forms, the art object. The art object is produced within these two historical and political contexts of famine. The artists in both cases are historical and political subjects. Abedin of 1943 and Gabra Christos Desta of 1984 are in two different historical moments, one through Churchill's wartime policies, which is one aspect of the famine, and the other one in the midst of the Cold War. The transnationality and the common ground of the art object is the politics behind the famine. So one should, of course, give critical importance to the form. The form is very important, as Iftikhar reminds me all the time. Since form, I'm almost finished. So since it's the form that produces the initial interaction, it's the form that brings the aesthetic imagination, and it is the form that gives meaning and knowledge. But for us in the global South, where power relations greatly determine our political lives, it's also the form that reminds us, and that reveals the predicaments of our human condition, that is informed by and that informs a transnational narrative. So for us, there is always a transnational story behind the form. So having said that, I had a lot to say, but let me wrap up and then we can do question and answer. I just wanted to talk about the types of ideas we should concentrate for future MAHASSA when we're going to have, I hope we'll have it. So finally, I would like to say, a platform like MAHASSA is very much needed for everyone who is concerned with the arts, but particularly for those of us who live in the global South. It is a rare platform that allows us to exchange and share ideas, where we can produce knowledge that can sustain our humanity, even when everything else falters. I've met so many people in MAHASSA who have inspired me and who I still talk to about different ideas. For instance, working with two MAHASSA alumni on a possible project that looks into the ideas and imagination of Blackness in Southeast Asia and Ethiopia. With the recent racial injustice outrage in America, we thought it was important to look into different ideas of Blackness. And if it had not been for MAHASSA, such projects would not have come to light. I have realized more than ever there is a lot to do, particularly as our present global crisis continues to worsen, and platforms like MAHASSA are important to have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth, for that bracing set of reflections on the MAHASSA program. And it's been great to hear all of you share your thoughts about MAHASSA. Diana, with thinking about both the context of the Dhaka Art Summit and how the conditions at the summit really kind of called for this blending of what you called the bringing of the modern into the contemporary art exhibition, right? What were the motivations? What were the conditions that led to that thinking? And the building on repetition, I think, and building on the present, but also building on the past, I think was a very important point that you made. to Iftikhar sharing the kind of the larger framework for thinking about how the program was built and what were the preoccupations and concerns that both the faculty and the participants were able to discuss and kind of like think about. And Elizabeth, I think you made very important points about what MAHASSA did accomplish and what remains to be done in terms of the work, the intellectual work that we were able to accomplish together. I think there are certain things that leap out to me, from the perspective of Asia Art Archive. I think there's certain questions that are very particularly germane for us as an organization. One of them is the dividing line precisely between the contemporary and the modern, because I think like the Dhaka Art Summit, AA began as an organization very much thinking about contemporary art history, but I think these questions of what divides the modern and the contemporary, particularly in the context of Asia or Africa, maybe is not as clear or not quite the same as the answers that would find in a kind of other context. And I think the turn to historical is precisely something that is very particular here. And secondly, I think as both Iftikhar and Elizabeth alluded to, I think there's a question of what is the perspective and the need to shift the perspective of art history away from a European, North American context, and how that kind of changes both our priorities and also our concerns. And I think it's great that all of you alluded to the fact that there are these kind of shared histories, right? Both the colonial past, but also the decolonial experience, right? And so these are commonalities, right? Even if there's particularities to be explored in greater detail. And I think in light of what Elizabeth offered in her contribution, I was wondering if Iftikhar and Diana, if you might be willing to venture, your thoughts on, so I think Elizabeth was very enthusiastic in calling for more MAHASSA, and I think several of our participants are actually online and voicing similar sentiments. I was wondering if you might be willing to share your thoughts on, what would you want to do, I guess, if there were to be a next step, or how would we continue MAHASSA the next 10 days, I guess?
Well, I think what was so interesting was also the shifting sites, right? Because I mean, it's so interesting. I really enjoyed that visit we had to Chungking Mansions in Hong Kong, and to kind of see this site where all of these histories were overlapping. And interestingly enough, like one of our faculty members, Ming Tian Po, was it her grandfather or her great grandfather who built that? I mean, it was incredible to see this kind of crowdfunding experiment of people in the Philippines building in Hong Kong and what that became. So I would love for the next iteration of of MAHASSA to happen somewhere in Africa. So like Elizabeth said, we had all these questions and commonalities. The Asias were a bit more familiar with each other than the Africa side. I think that's probably the next step. And for me, because I've spent, I mean, not enough time, but I've been to Senegal quite a few times. I found the parallels between Senegal and Dhaka incredible in the sense of nation building through culture. Even I showed those Raschi Chaudhary tapestries. I would love to see some kind of parallel between Papa Ibra Tall and Raschi Chaudhary, because they were active at the same time, studied under similar conditions. So I think that would be an interesting next step. I would actually love to see that with the same participants, again, like trying to deepen what we're doing. I know Simon, one of our faculty members, actually a lot of the faculty members have ideas of textbooks and future publications, but I think another in-person meeting in Africa would probably be a great next step.
Elizabeth has to invite us.
I'm waiting to come. Sorry.
No, I think Diana is seconding your...
Yes, the money I will invite, no problem.
Yeah, so I think seconding Diana's, Diana's thoughts. I think one way we obviously this is the first time when we came together, and I as our speakers have mentioned, the participants are really strong and thinkers and doing important research. Unfortunately, we couldn't. I wish we could have their voice also here on this platform. So I think one got a sense that of the kind of the range and diversity of work that is happening in terms of research, but also the questions that need to be be asked more. I think this is, for me, this was the first time. I mean, I teach comparative modernities, and I have students at Cornell who come from, from Africa and Southeast Asia as well as South Asia. But I think the density of MAHASSA, and the kind of intensive way in which we were together and we were confronting these questions was, I think, both insightful in terms of what we share, but also kind of divergent trajectories. There are two ways to think about it. One way is to think about the common shaping of institutions and nations and experiences that have to do with the coming of modernity and colonialism and decolonization and so on, right? And some of it is also specific to that. There's the Anglophone experience, and there's the Francophone experience and so on. And their relation to culture is somewhat different. The second is, of course, conscious connections that were made, right? The South to South exchanges, the decolonization kind of movements, okay, the exhibitions that took place, like the Dhaka, the Asian Art Biennale in Dhaka, and and meetings like Bandung and so on, as well as meetings that took place in Africa, regional festivals in the Arab world as well. So I think these are also important ways in which there is throughout really from the time of negritude onwards, there is a conscious attempt to think beyond singular nation states and to think about these broader questions of connections. And we see that running, there are, people know about Bandung now, 1955, but there were several other, there were so many other kind of meetings and exchanges that took place. So I think both thinking of both of them in their specificity is important. Both the kind of the shared experience that comes from a common shaping of modern history, but also the conscious attempts by intellectuals, artists, thinkers to connect during the 20th century into the present. So I think Elizabeth, your provocation that MAHASSA is yet another one of those meetings is, I think, both I think insightful and humbling as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Iftikhar, for sharing your thoughts on the work that still remains to be done. I should say that we are taking questions, so if those of you in the audience might have any questions, feel free to contribute. You can go to the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I think if you're joining us via Facebook, you can actually put in a question, and those will be relayed to us by our colleagues at Asia Archive in America. We do have one question, thinking about questions of connections, which is from Miguel de Baca. He says, thank you everyone for a wonderful summary of the MAHASSA project and convenings. My question is, in light of the COVID global health crisis, whether and how research needs have changed. Are there any new urgencies or pressure points? So.
But definitely, I think things will change in the wake of COVID. I think this is a time for scholars as well as artists and other practitioners to reflect. Okay, I think it may be too early to say what will come out of it, honestly, because people need time to kind of think. But I think, given the one thing that certainly occurs to me is that the whole sense of security, well-being, and in the world is a very different one now than it was, even a year ago. Because you see nation states arming themselves to the teeth and funding their militaries and so on. And what did that do to, did that provide any security when COVID came along? So I think the question of whether, and also COVID is a global crisis in the sense that one of the things it may lead to is a worldwide economic depression, because it's not limited to one region or one area, but in fact it's affecting the entire world. So I think the question of connection, relation, thinking histories and experiences together remains a very important one. How it will change research is, of course, it's already changing research. Many of our students and faculty and so on cannot go into the field. Many artists are stuck at home. That their work will change accordingly. I think this is we are living through a very transformative kind of time right now. I cannot predict what the next 5 years will look like, but definitely I don't think they'll be the same as the questions are going to shift, definitely.
I think something that's also touching on what Iftikhar said, it's also, I guess this is a more bigger picture thing, but it's empowering people and younger people on a local level to do the best job and research that they can. So maybe we can't travel, but there's a lot that they can see while at home. And like another layer of this MAHASSA story was a friend of mine, Mary Spirito, introduced me to Bruce Altschuler, who's done a lot of work on exhibition history. And this idea of trying to bring together MAHASSA, he's never been to Dhaka. I would have loved for him to be there, but he was so encouraging and inspiring as, a young curator working on making exhibitions. There's so many layers of empowering people. So I think we had our time, we set a stage, but I think MAHASSA really encouraged young scholars in Bangladesh that there's a lot of work they can do in their own backyard. And also they have the language skills and capacity to do that. So how do we use this digital platform to let people work more deeply locally and make those connections, I guess, on our digital level? I mean, that's not a huge, but if we can't travel, again, there are people that have access that maybe didn't know what they should be looking for.
Yeah, and I kind of want to follow up on that and maybe just say one of the things, we've been talking about people who work on the individual regions themselves, but I think one of the most impressive things for me as one of the organizers was seeing how at least a few of the participants were actually already thinking about the intersections and the way that, for instance, the Indian Ocean, and this was one of the kind of themes of the Dhaka gathering, was the Indian Ocean as a kind of a connective body of water, right? And people who were researching the connections between the regions rather than thinking about the parallels between the region, like from one to the other, they're already kind of thinking about how they are actually connected. And so I think that, that seems to be something that the younger scholars that we convened are very much kind of thinking about in a very kind of, powerful way. And, addressing Miguel's question, I think that, we need to think more about those connections that already exist and how that kind of, even if it seems like, there are forces that are trying to kind of tear those apart or undo those connections. I think we need to think more about those. Now we have, Elizabeth, do you have anything you'd like to share, or should we move on to more questions? More questions? Okay, we have a few questions, so I'm going to just read them together. So from Mosat, we have the question: according to shifting to modern to contemporary art in Southeast Asia, when does it start? 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s? So that's one question. Then from the artist Bahar Bahabahani, thank you so much for this inspiring, informative talk. I would love to know if Elizabeth or Iftikhar could elaborate more about form that Elizabeth mentioned in her talk. And then the last question from Jane. I was particularly interested by the idea of connecting art histories by looking at themes of art and famine and art and colonial education, academies and otherwise. What other types of themes can you all think of? Art and trade? As an ex-banker, I am interested in the lack of attention to the issue of the impact of commerce, trade flows, and patronage in the discussions. So 3 good questions, and you're free to pick and choose.
The first question, my internet dropped, so I didn't hear the first question, John. Can you repeat it?
Yes, the first question was, according to shifting it to Southeast Asia, when does the shift from modern to contemporary begin? In the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s?
Okay, the second question is what? I think somebody asked me specifically. That's what I dropped, maybe. Sorry.
Okay. The second question is if either you or Iftikhar could elaborate more about what you mentioned, what you meant by form in your talk.
For me, the art object, Iftikhar always reminds me that I get really entangled up with the politics of the form. rather than the form itself, So we have to do a formalist analysis. The art object is the formalist analysis, and everything that is deserving to analyze the object itself should come in first, rather than just the politics behind it. So my writing usually concentrates on the politics of the form, what's behind the form. So it's the form that creates, like I said, the aesthetic imagination. The conversation itself is initiated through the form. So the art object meaning. So we really focus on the form and formal analysis, and before going into anything else. That's what I meant. And Iftikhar can go further.
Yeah, I mean, it's this is the old kind of, I suppose in some ways, a false dichotomy between kind of the autonomy of the artistic form and its relation and its placing in a kind of a socio-political historical context. And I'm saying it's a false dichotomy because in some ways, so from a disciplinary perspective, let's say from an art history or an aesthetics perspective, it's always better to begin with the work itself and the form of the work itself, rather than the historical questions. Because what that does is, this is the difference, I suppose, when historians write books and then they have images. Those are used as illustrations, really, to the argument, right? And I think what that doesn't do enough is to attend to in some ways, the power of the form itself. Because usually artistic forms, especially in modernism, right, are a result of much kind of density of thinking, reflection, practice, engagement, experimentation. And so what they do is they embody, the form itself embodies the tensions, if you will, okay, of the time, of the person, of the era. But in some ways, it may also exceed that. So in other words, using artworks as illustrations for historical processes, what it does is it flattens out all those meanings, right? Whereas artworks may also contain utopian possibilities, right? As well as, so they are part of their time and yet not part of their time as well, right? They are also part of their location of the particular time and place where they are made, but they also exceed that in many ways. And I think attending to all of that gives is a way to think about the artistic form and the power it holds to speak to us in the present. If they were only historical artifacts, they would not speak to us in the present or across time and space. Okay.
Okay, and does anyone want to?
James, I just want to take a stab at it. Just like the famine, yeah, there will be a common ground in art. Actually, art and trade is a far better, platform for commonality than famine. Famine doesn't really occur too many times. So and that was So art and trade, particularly, it bothers me. For example, right now, I mean, art has been. For me, it bothers me because, and I was cut off before I talked about curatorial practice that John beautifully organized in Hong Kong. We talked about that, what curatorial practice meant, and curatorial practice has become really, it's become commodified, very much commodified, and it's coming, mostly coming from the North, co-opting the voices of local voices, and our own curators hurriedly trying to fit into that narrative. So trade, whether you see trade in that way, I do, but the production of art has become really problematic for particularly for the global South. Our production from the global South is becoming really problematic, very commodified into trendy narratives, in vogue narratives, cocooned into these types of narratives. So yeah, art and trade is what brought this thing into conception in the global South, and I mean it's pervasive all over, Yeah, so art and trade is a very good common ground, I would say, for a future MAHASSA, if there's going to be one.
Yeah, especially from a locus point of Hong Kong.
Yes.
Okay. Questions of patronage have always been, I think, I think these are important questions. And it's but art has always been, in some ways the result of accumulation, okay, since the beginning of history, really. So so I think the question of art and its relation to, let's say, social exploitation, okay, but also the patronage that comes along with it, are, I think, questions that are historical, but also have specific resonance in the modern era, but especially in the neoliberal kind of era in the last 30, 40 years. And I think I would just argue against flattening one's analysis. So, is not to see, again, art as a mirror of patronage of the economic aspects of patronage, because as I mentioned, the works can also exceed that, okay, in terms of what they intend to do.
Okay, we are almost out of time, but we have one comment from Rahul Goodipudi saying "preach," so clearly resonating, and also I wanted to give space to one of the MAHASSA participants, Samina Iqbal, who made a suggestion and a question asking, I wonder if designing an exhibition of the common histories and intersections would also be something that we can think about for a future MAHASSA project. Maybe this will generate some scholarship in solidarity. And then in tandem with that, there's a couple of other people in the Q&A section who are asking, one of whom said that, I'm a student of art history and this is the first time I've seen some of these artworks. Are you thinking of doing a compilation of images available online? Does it exist already? And this person is based in Madrid. They're an anonymous attendee. And then related to that, another person who's asking, are there particular types of methodologies and resources that each of you rely on or refer to in your research and curatorial work? And this is in the context of the lack of archives and catalogs in these regions. So any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, these are all questions we wrestle with, and we wrestle with basically every day, many of us. And I think there are no short, unfortunately, we can't answer this in like 1 or 2 minutes, but essentially there's a need to develop more research, more kind of teaching tools, more kind of, databases. I mean, all these things are needed. And this is a work that doesn't, it's not a work that's possible for any one single person to do, but it's really a work that needs, teamwork, collaboration, institutions backing it. So, in other words, there's no short-term answer, but there's, but also the exciting thing about this issue is that there's tremendous work to be done. So there is endless possibility for making contributions. Okay, it's a great field to be in.
Yes. Diana, Elizabeth, do you have any other thoughts?
I mean, yeah, the work doesn't stop, and it would be wonderful. Again, we haven't seen some of these images, but sometimes the images are also better than the condition of the actual artwork. So like, where does the work stop? Like, how do we start conserving the works that we're doing research on? I mean, there's so many layers of the amount of work that's needed to be done. But I think that MAHASSA was a wonderful kind of spark of team building and also everyone here on this call. Like, it's a process we can all be part of together. And yeah, like Iftikhar, no one person or one institution can do it. It's through finding this intersectionality and yeah, I guess making a plan. But it's, again, hard to plan right now, but yeah.
Yeah, and these are certainly encouraging thoughts, and for those of us working at preserving precisely the question of archives and history through the archive. So I think, unfortunately, we will have to wrap it up there, but we will share unanswered questions with the panelists so that they can follow up directly if they have thoughts. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think we're continuing to get more questions as I speak, but I will share them with you via email, and hopefully they can be answered privately. So thank you, everyone who is joining us on Facebook and on Zoom. I think we have over 100 participants combined, maybe like 150 or so. And it's great to see all of you and to see all of the participants, MAHASSA participants who are following us on WhatsApp. They've been having a very active WhatsApp group conversation during this. And hopefully we'll be able to reconvene for further programs with the participants and with you. And thank you all, Diana, Iftikhar, and Elizabeth for joining us. And thank you, Hillary and Jane, for hosting what hopefully will be the first of several events related to MAHASSA. Thank you. Bye.